My name is Victoria Cross, and I was 28 years old when I discovered that the people who raised me had built their empire on a lie that belonged to me. For 28 years, I called them Mom and Dad, believed their stories about my birth mother being a troubled young woman who couldn't care for me, and felt grateful they'd given me a home and a future. Then, I found a letter hidden in their safe. I found the letter by accident, which is how most world-shattering discoveries happen. My adoptive father, Richard, had asked me to retrieve some documents from his home office safe while he was traveling for business. The combination was my birthday, a detail that felt sentimental at the time, that would later feel like mockery. I'd opened the safe countless times before, always grabbing whatever file he needed and nothing more. The dutiful daughter who never questioned or pried. But that day, a folder slipped from my hands and fell, spilling papers across the Persian rug. As I gathered them, a cream-colored envelope caught my attention. It was addressed to Richard and Diane Cross, regarding the estate of Margot Blackwell. Margot Blackwell, my birth mother's name, the one I'd been told only once, the name that existed in my life as nothing more than a historical footnote. I should have put it back, should have respected privacy, maintained boundaries, acted like the well-trained daughter I'd been raised to be. Instead, I opened it. The letter was from a law firm, dated 27 years ago, 1 year after my adoption was finalized. It was formal, dense with legal language, but the core message was impossible to misunderstand. Margot Blackwell had died in a car accident when I was 13 months old. Her will had left her entire estate estimated at $47 million in 1996, to her infant daughter, me. The estate was to be held in trust until I reached age 25, at which point I would gain full access. My hands started shaking as I read further. The letter outlined the terms of the trust, the name of the trustee firm that would manage it, and the specific instructions Margot had left for my education, my well-being, and my future. She'd planned for everything. This woman I'd never known, this mother who'd apparently loved me enough to ensure I'd never want for anything. Except I had wanted 4 things. I'd worked 2 jobs through college because my adoptive parents said they couldn't afford to pay my full tuition. I'd lived in their house until I was 26, told repeatedly that I should be grateful they were letting me stay rent-free while I built my career. I'd felt indebted, lesser than, lucky to be tolerated. And the entire time, there had been money. My money. Money from a mother who'd died trying to protect my future. I kept reading, my breath coming faster, my vision tunneling. The letter referenced attached documents regarding the transfer of trust assets and acknowledgement of fiduciary responsibilities. But there were no attached documents in the envelope, just this one letter, hidden in a safe like evidence of a crime. I heard the garage door open. Diane, my adoptive mother, was home early from her tennis match. I shoved everything back into the safe, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. I grabbed the documents Richard had asked for and left his office, my face carefully neutral, my hands steady through sheer force of will. That night, I lay in my apartment, the small 1-bedroom I could barely afford, on my marketing salary and stared at the ceiling. I'd taken photos of the letter before putting it back, my hands moving on autopilot, some instinct telling me I'd need evidence. I pulled up the photos on my phone now, reading the letter again and again, each pass revealing new layers of betrayal. My birth mother had left me $47 million in 1996, with proper investment over 27 years. That fortune should have grown exponentially. Conservatively, it should be worth over $200 million now. Where was it? Where was any of it? I thought about Richard and Diane's lifestyle, the mansion in the suburbs, the vacation home in Aspen, the luxury cars, the country club membership, the art collection. Richard's company, Cross Enterprises, is a boutique investment firm that has somehow grown from a small operation to a billion-dollar powerhouse over the past 2 decades. The timeline was too perfect, too coincidental. They hadn't just hidden my inheritance, they'd used it, built their empire with my mother's money, my money, while telling me I should be grateful they'd given me a home. I felt something cold and dark settle into my chest, something that tasted like rage but felt like clarity. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to ask for explanations or give them a chance to lie their way out of this. I was going to destroy them, methodically, legally, completely, and I was going to enjoy every moment of it. The next morning, I called in sick to work and went to the public records office. If Margot Blackwell had died with a will, there would be probate records. If a trust had been established, there would be documentation. If money had changed hands, there would be a paper trail. I just needed to know where to look. I started with the probate court records from 1996. Searching for Margot's name, it took 3 hours of scrolling through microfiche, technology that felt ancient but contained truths people thought they'd buried before I found it. Estate of Margot Elizabeth Blackwell, deceased. Probate case filed in October 1996. One beneficiary listed, Victoria Blackwell, minor child. I requested copies of the entire file. The clerk looked at me with bored indifference as she processed my request, and had no idea she was handing me a weapon that would dismantle an empire. The file was thick, comprehensive, and damning. Margot's will was there, along with an inventory of her assets, stocks, bonds, real estate properties, and a trust fund she'd inherited from her own parents. The total estate value was listed at $47.3 million. The will appointed a law firm Thornton and Associates as trustee, with explicit instructions that the assets be professionally managed until I turned 20, at which point I would receive full control. There was also documentation of my adoption. Richard and Diane Cross had adopted me in 1995. When I was 6 months old, 3 months before Margot died, the adoption had been private, arranged through a now-defunct agency. Margot had been a single mother, struggling with postpartum depression, according to the case file. Deemed temporarily unfit for parenting, the adoption was supposed to be temporary. A foster arrangement until she stabilized. She'd died before she could get me back. I felt a grief I hadn't expected for a woman I'd never known, a mother who'd lost her daughter twice, once to the system, once to death. But the real discovery was in the trustee documentation. Thornton and Associates had managed the trust for exactly 4 years after Margot's death. Then, in 2000, there was a transfer of trustee responsibilities to Richard Cross, my adoptive father, citing his familial relationship and financial expertise. That's when the trail went cold in the public records. But I knew where to look next. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Sandra Reeves, who specialized in financial fraud. I didn't tell her everything at first, just that I suspected my adoptive parents had mismanaged a trust that belonged to me. She asked for the documentation I'd found, studied it for 2 days, then called me with a voice that was professionally neutral but couldn't quite hide her disgust. "Your adoptive father didn't just mismanage this trust," Sandra said. "He liquidated it. Between 2000 and 2005, every asset from your mother's estate was either sold or transferred. The proceeds went into accounts controlled by Richard Cross personally, and from there into his company, Cross Enterprises. Can you prove that?" My voice was steady, cold. "I can trace the money. Whether that's enough for a legal case, you'll need a lawyer to determine. But Victoria, this is one of the most blatant cases of theft I've ever seen. He didn't even try to hide it well. He just assumed no one would ever look." "He assumed I wouldn't look," I corrected, "because he raised me to be grateful and compliant and to never question them." "What are you going to do?" I thought about Richard and Diane, about the life they'd built on my mother's grave, about the way they'd kept me small and dependent and grateful for scraps while sitting on a fortune that belonged to me. "I'm going to take everything," I said. "Every dollar, every asset, every piece of their reputation, and I'm going to make sure they know exactly why." I assembled a legal team like I was preparing for war, because that's exactly what this was. My lead attorney was Marcus Chen, a litigation specialist with a reputation for taking on impossible cases and winning through sheer ruthlessness. When I walked into his office with Sandra's financial investigation and the probate documents, his eyes lit up with the kind of predatory interest that told me I'd chosen correctly. "This is theft, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and probably a dozen other charges," Marcus said, reviewing the documents with increasing satisfaction. "Your adoptive father took control of a multi-million-dollar trust and systematically looted it for his own benefit. The evidence is clear. I want to sue for the full value of the inheritance, with interest and damages," I said, "and I want to go after Cross Enterprises, too. If he built that company with my money, I want a stake in it." Marcus smiled. And it wasn't a nice smile. "We can do better than a stake. If we can prove that the company's initial capital and growth came from your trust assets, we can argue that the entire company should be considered proceeds of the theft. You wouldn't just get a portion, you could potentially take the whole thing." The thought sent a dark thrill through me. Richard had built Cross Enterprises into a billion-dollar investment firm, had spent 20 years cultivating his reputation as a financial genius. finding out it was all built on stolen money from his adopted daughter's dead mother that would destroy him more completely than just taking the money back. "Let's do it," I said. The next 6 months were a masterclass in legal warfare. Marcus and his team subpoenaed decades of financial records, bank statements, investment accounts, corporate filings for cross enterprises. They interviewed former employees of Thornton and Associates, tracking down anyone who remembered the Blackwell Trust and its transfer to Richard's control. They found a forensic accountant who could trace money through the kind of shell companies and transfers that Richard had thought made him clever. The trail was complex, but it existed. Money from Margot's estate liquidated in 2000 to 2005, transferred through several intermediaries, then invested as capital in the early expansion of cross enterprises. Richard had been smarter than some criminals. He'd paid taxes on the money, had reported it as income and investment gains, had done enough to make it look legitimate on the surface. But he'd also left evidence of the source, account numbers that traced back to the Blackwell Trust, transfer memos that referenced estate funds, his own handwritten notes in old files that Sandra found through discovery, casually mentioning using V's inheritance for the Silicon Valley deal. Me, Victoria, he'd stolen my inheritance and had been so confident he'd never be caught that he'd documented it. While the legal team built the case, I maintained perfect cover. I still showed up to family dinners, still smiled and made small talk, still played the role of devoted daughter. Richard and Diane had no idea what was coming. They thought I was the same compliant girl they'd raised, still grateful, still manageable. The night before we filed the lawsuit, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and thought about Margot. I'd spent the past months researching her too, finding old photos, reading articles about the car accident that killed her. She'd been 24 when she died, just 4 years younger than I was now. She'd been smart, ambitious, had inherited money from her parents, and grown it through savvy investments. She'd also been depressed and overwhelmed after my birth, struggling with a system that took her daughter away for her own good, and never gave her the chance to prove she could recover. I wondered what she'd think of me now, if she'd approve of what I was about to do, if she'd want revenge or reconciliation. But Margot was dead, and she'd left me a fortune to ensure I'd have choices. Richard and Diane had stolen that. They'd stolen her last gift to me, had built their lives on her death, and had never once felt guilty enough to tell me the truth. They didn't deserve forgiveness. They deserved exactly what they were about to get. We filed the lawsuit on a Tuesday morning, and I made sure Richard and Diane were served simultaneously at a charity gala they were hosting. Marcus had advised against it, said it was unnecessarily theatrical, that we should serve them privately. But I'd insisted. I wanted them humiliated. I wanted their friends and business associates to watch the process servers hand them legal documents in the middle of their carefully curated event. I wasn't there to see it, but Marcus's assistant filmed it on her phone from across the room. I watched the video later that night, over and over, studying their faces. Richard's confusion turned to recognition, turning to fear. Diane's hand flying to her mouth, her perfect composure cracking. The whispers spread through the room as people realized something was very wrong. The gala ended early, their reputation cracking before the lawsuit even made the news. The lawsuit was comprehensive and devastating. It accused Richard and Diane Cross of fraud, theft, breach of fiduciary duty, conversion of assets, and unjust enrichment. It detailed how Richard had taken control of my trust, liquidated all assets, and used the money to build cross enterprises. It demanded the return of the full inheritance value estimated with growth at $237 million plus punitive damages, plus a controlling stake in cross enterprises itself. The media coverage was immediate and brutal. Billionaire investment mogul, accused of stealing adopted daughter's inheritance, ran the first headline. Others followed, built on betrayal. How Richard Cross created an empire with his daughter's money, and the $237 million theft, adoptive parents face. Lawsuit over hidden fortune. Richard called me that night. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail that I saved as evidence, his voice shaking with rage. "Victoria, what the hell do you think you're doing? We raised you, gave you everything, and this is how you repay us. Call me back immediately so we can discuss this privately before you destroy this family." I forwarded the voicemail to Marcus with a note. "Please add emotional manipulation to the filing." Diane tried a different approach. She showed up at my apartment the next day, eyes red from crying, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. For a moment, I almost felt something like sympathy. Then I remembered the letter hidden in the safe, the years of lies, the fortune she'd helped steal. "Victoria, sweetheart, please," she said through my closed door. "Let me explain. It's not what you think. Your father was trying to protect you." "He's not my father," I said through the door, my voice cold. "And you need to leave before I call the police for harassment." I heard her crying in the hallway, heard her eventually leave. I felt nothing. The discovery process was brutal for Richard and Diane. Marcus subpoenaed everything: decades of financial records, personal correspondence, internal company documents, every secret they'd kept, every questionable deal, every piece of their carefully constructed image was torn apart and examined. The evidence was even worse than we'd initially thought. Richard hadn't just used my inheritance as initial capital, he'd continued to draw from it over the years, using loan structures that were never repaid, funneling money through complex arrangements that all ultimately benefited him. The $47 million from 1996 had been completely absorbed into cross enterprises by 2010, used to fund expansions, acquisitions, and Richard's personal lifestyle. 3 months into the lawsuit, Richard's lawyers approached Marcus with a settlement offer: $50 million, a public apology, and a promise to never contact me again. Marcus called me to discuss it. "It's not a bad offer. We'd avoid a trial, you'd get money immediately, and you could move on with your life." "What about cross enterprises?" I asked. "That's not part of the offer. They'd keep the company." "Then no," I said. "I want to go to trial. I want a jury to hear everything they did, and I want that company." "Victoria, going to trial is risky. There's always a chance." "I don't care about risk," I interrupted. "I care about justice, and I want them to lose everything, the way they made me lose everything I should have had." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right, we go to trial." The trial lasted 3 weeks and made national headlines every single day. I sat in the courtroom and watched Richard and Diane squirm as their lawyers tried to defend the indefensible. They claimed they'd managed the trust for my benefit, that they'd invested the money wisely, that they'd always intended to give it to me eventually. They painted themselves as responsible parents who'd made difficult financial decisions. Marcus tore them apart. He presented the documented evidence of asset liquidation, the transfers into Richard's personal accounts, and the company filings showing where my inheritance became their capital. He brought in forensic accountants who explained to the jury exactly how the money had moved. He showed them Richard's handwritten notes, casually referring to V's money like it was a resource he owned. He also presented something I hadn't expected: testimony from a former employee of Thornton and Associates who remembered the Blackwell Trust transfer. The woman, now retired, testified that she'd questioned the decision to give Richard control, that she'd expressed concerns about conflicts of interest. Her supervisor had overridden her, swayed by Richard's reputation and promises that he'd manage the trust in Victoria's best interest. "Did he manage it in her best interest?" Marcus asked. "No," the woman said, looking at me with something like pity. "He stole from that child, and I've felt guilty about not fighting harder to stop it for 20 years. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Richard and Diane Cross were guilty of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conversion of assets. The judge's ruling was even better than I'd hoped. The court ordered Richard and Diane to pay me $237 million, the estimated current value of my inheritance with appropriate growth. Additionally, because Cross Enterprises had been built using stolen trust assets, the court determined that I was entitled to an equity stake proportional to the stolen capital's contribution to the company's growth. The forensic accountants calculated that contribution at 73%, 73% of $1 billion company. I walked out of that courtroom, owning the majority stake in Cross Enterprises. Richard retained 18%, Diane had 9%, and I controlled everything else. I could make decisions without their approval, could restructure the company, and could even vote them out of their own business. The first thing I did was call a board meeting and remove Richard as CEO. He tried to fight it, but I had the votes. I watched his face as his board, people he'd hired and worked with for decades, voted with me. They were pragmatic business people, and I was now the majority shareholder. Their loyalty shifted in real time. "You can't do this," Richard said, his voice shaking. "I built this company. It's mine." "You built it with my money," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "Money my birth mother left to me. Money you stole while I was too young to stop you. This company was never yours. It was always mine. You just didn't know it yet." I installed a new CEO, someone with a reputation for aggressive growth and ethical business practices. I restructured the company's leadership, removing anyone who'd been complicit in Richard's schemes. I even changed the name. Cross Enterprises became Blackwell Capital, named from my birth mother. The $237 million judgment was paid through the forced sale of Richard and Diane's assets. The mansion went on the market, the Aspen vacation home, the art collection, the luxury cars. Their country club membership was revoked when they couldn't pay the dues. They moved into a modest condo, still wealthy by most standards. Their 27% stake in Blackwell Capital was worth something, but nothing like the empire they'd built. I never spoke to them again. They tried, of course. Diane sent letters I didn't read. Richard attempted to reach out through mutual acquaintances, looking for reconciliation or at least understanding. I ignored it all. I used some of the money to establish a foundation in Margot's name, focused on supporting single mothers and preventing wrongful separation of families. I wanted something good to come from her death, from her money, from the legacy she'd tried to leave me. I also started therapy, working through the complex grief of losing a mother I never knew and discovering that the parents who raised me were monsters. It was hard, ugly work, but necessary. 3 years after the trial, I was sitting in my office at Blackwell Capital, the office that used to be Richard's, on the top floor with views of the city, when my assistant buzzed. "There's a Diane Cross online too. Should I know?" I said. "Add her to the blocked list." "Already done," my assistant said, and I heard the smile in her voice. I turned back to my computer, reviewing the quarterly earnings report. Blackwell Capital was thriving under new leadership, growing faster than it ever had under Richard. The company's reputation had recovered from the scandal, and the market respected the aggressive restructuring and ethical reforms I'd implemented. I was 31 years old, worth over $1 billion, and in control of a company that had been built with my stolen inheritance. I'd taken everything from the people who'd taken everything from me. Some people might call it revenge. I call it justice. Richard and Diane had made a choice when I was too young to fight back. They'd decided my inheritance was worth more than my trust, that their greed was more important than their integrity, that they could build a life on a dead woman's money and a child's stolen future. They were wrong, and I made sure they paid for that mistake with everything they had. Margot Blackwell died trying to ensure her daughter would have security and choices. Richard and Diane Cross stole that gift and tried to bury the truth, but I found it. I fought back, and I won. Not just the money, not just the company, but something more important: the knowledge that people who betray you, who steal from you, who build their lives on your loss, they don't get away with it forever. Sometimes the child you wronged grows up, and sometimes she comes back to collect what's owed. With interest.